everyone, and welcome to Change's 2021 39th Colloquium. We will be heard. My name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director here at Change, the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education at Brookdale Community College in Lincroft, New Jersey. Welcome. Before I continue, I want to note that our center is housed on the occupied territory of the Lenape people. Now, many of you are familiar with what a normal colloquium looks like, and it is not in my office. Normally, it takes place at the community college, at the arena, and it is an event. Thousands of students, educators, and community members fill the Brookdale Community College arena for our plenary. And then dozens of breakout workshops follow, featuring Holocaust and genocide survivors, human rights experts, and activists and scholars. This year, Change is hosting our second virtual colloquium, and I'll be perfectly honest, hopefully our last. Next year, we hope to invite you back for an in-person colloquium, probably with a hybrid option, that will be hosted back at the college and filled to the brim with all of you. Until then, thank you for being here and for joining us as we work to make our community, our state, and our world a better place. Today, our colloquium includes this plenary session featuring Alexandra Zapruder. Alexandra will speak about the significance of diaries written by Jewish teens during the Holocaust, along with the importance of literary and artistic expressions created by teens throughout the recent COVID pandemic. After that, we are going to engage with the audience during a Q&A. So please use the chat feature on Facebook or email us at contact@change.org to send us your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. After this plenary presentation, please visit our YouTube channel to view our playlist of more than 20 available workshops on a variety of topics, including the Holocaust, 20th century genocides, American slavery, gender and sexual identity, and standing up against hate. And for our educators, if you are registered for today's program, you will also receive an email with accompanying lesson plans. And if you're not registered, don't worry, just reach out to us and we will gladly get you that information. Our center has worked now for the past 42 years to promote the elimination of racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of prejudice through innovative education about the Holocaust, other instances of genocide, and human rights. It has now been 14 months since we went virtual last March, and it's been a hard year. But thanks to your support, our center has provided more than 50 public-facing programs that have reached now over 55,000 people across 6 continents, and dozens more for schools and various faith and interest-based groups. This programming occurs because of the generosity of our members and program participants like you. So please consider joining Change as a member or signing up for information about our future programming. To join, visit our website, change.org. That's change with 2 H's. Today, we are very proud to recognize our 2021 Colloquium sponsors, and we are so grateful for your ongoing support. Warm thanks to the B'nai Shalom Bethel Foundation, Congregation Torat El, Doug Friedman and Linda Lashbrook, Jerry and Audrey Harnick, Barbara and Joe Hollander, the Colber Family Foundation, Trish and Curtis Kreitzberg, PNC Bank, Missy Peck and Stu Rosenberg, and Myrna and Bob Raskin. Thank you also to Change staff, Allie Evans, Spencer Cronin, Susan Yellen, and Callie for helping with today's program. Thank you to the host of volunteers and workshop leaders who worked with us to create this day. And thank you to Brookdale Community College for being an ongoing thought partner and collaborator. And special thanks, warm thanks, heartfelt thanks to all of you for being here. Together, we are harnessing the power of innovative education, and together we will eliminate racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of prejudice. Thanks to this special and warm partnership we have with Brookdale Community College, we are also proud to have today Dr. David Stout, president of Brookdale Community College, here to share a few words with our community. Dr. Stout.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. It's a pleasure to be here again at Chhange Colloquium. This annual event is one of my favorite events that we have every year. As you mentioned, Dr. Brown, when we have the colloquium on campus and we fit 1,800 students in our arena, and then we have breakout sessions all over the campus, everybody has an opportunity to see the beauty of Brookdale Community College, which is located in Monmouth County, New Jersey. But it's also such a powerful day when people have an opportunity to learn about the impact of prejudice and discrimination and racism and anti-Semitism. So it's such a powerful day. And here we are doing this virtually, which allows us to expand the audience, obviously, to not only a much larger audience of what we could fit in our auditorium, but also we can reach internationally. So I understand we do have an international audience today here watching us, and could not be prouder to be the host site of this extraordinary center. Chhange is the best of all of our Holocaust, human rights, and genocide education centers across the country. I say that with no bias at all. I know it for a fact. We have the best, and that has everything to do with the fact that we have an incredible staff. Dr. Brown, your leadership of the center, and of course, having built on a history of success with Chhange as well, and under the leadership of your board chair, Howard Dorman. So I want to thank everyone who's involved in the development of this program. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for your leadership. And I have to say how incredibly excited I am to listen to Alexandra Zapruder speak today about the diaries of those who have been directly affected and are having those lived experiences that we so desperately need to be reminded of, so that we can once and for all conquer this trend to continue to experience Holocaust and genocide across the world. So Alexandra, thank you so much for joining us. Cannot wait to hear you. And I'm going to step out of the way so I'm not in the way of this entire audience hearing what you have to say. So Dr. Brown, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and thank you for inviting me to speak this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Stout, for your kind words, and also just for your continued support and for championing change. It's really, it's uplifting, and I'm so grateful for our partnership with the college, and also proud to be housed here on the Lincroft campus, which is beautiful. And next year, hopefully we will be able to bring you all here to see it firsthand. It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Alexandra Zapruder tells us that young people have always found ways to be heard. She began her career as a member of the founding staff of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And in 2002, Alexandra completed her first book, Salvaged Pages, Young Writers' Diaries of the Holocaust, which won the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category. She then went on to write and co-produce I'm Still Here, a documentary film for young audiences that was based on her book and which was nominated for 2 Emmy Awards. In November 2016, she published her second book, 26 Seconds, a personal history of the Zapruder film. She has also curated a permanent exhibition titled And Still I Write, Young Diarists on War and Genocide, which opened at the Holocaust Museum in Houston, and currently serves as the education director of the Defiant Requiem Foundation. Part of Alexandra's program does include some audiovisual content, and you may experience some delay when viewing and listening to that content. This is due to both the wonders and the limitations of the virtual world and live streaming audiovisual content via Zoom and into Facebook Live. If for some reason you experience a delay, don't worry. We will be including links to that content and making it available for anyone who wishes to view it. And now, please join me in welcoming Alexandra Zapruder.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely introduction. I want to thank Chhange for inviting me, Sarah, Allie and Spencer on the staff who have done such a beautiful job of organizing everything and getting us coordinated, and of course, Dr. Stout as well. I'm so happy to be here. I would rather be there. I would rather be looking at the faces of thousands and thousands of young people instead of sitting in my TV room. but we will do our best. And I'm so pleased that you all are here to listen. So if I were with you in person, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've ever written in a journal or a diary, because diary writing and journal writing is something that used to be a very common practice. Lots of people did it. I did it when I was young. And I thought I would start this morning with a story that I don't usually share with adults, but I kept a diary when I was probably starting when I was about 8 or 9. And when I was 12, my twin brother, who was then and remains one of my very favorite people, read my diary and then went next door and told our next door neighbor, Jimmy Patemra, that I was in love with him, which was true. And that was kind of a horrifying experience to have at 12 years old. I mean, after that, my parents got me a diary with a lock on it, which I think was a good decision. And I kept, in spite of that violation of my privacy, I kept writing in diaries and journals all through high school and college. And I've thought a lot about, especially in the last year or so, why. Why do people do this? For me, it was a place to record my own thoughts and my own feelings. It's a place to work out problems. It's a place to confess secrets, unless you have a mischievous twin brother. And it's a place to note the details of your day, to remember things that have happened, both good and bad. When I think back on the diaries that I kept, in particular in high school and in college, that's where I wrote my first ideas, my dreams, my plans. I worked out my conflicts. It is, in the end, a place to be quietly in connection with the self. That's really what a diary is all about. I don't really remember when I stopped writing in a journal, and I don't really even know where those journals are. I'm sure they're somewhere. They're probably in my mother's attic. But I do know how my interest in young writers' historical diaries began. When I graduated from college, I returned home to Washington, D.C., which is where I'm from. And I was lucky enough to get a job at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which at that time was not yet open to the public. It was still in its formative years. And I was hired to work on an exhibition that some of you may know called Remember the Children, Daniel's Story. And this is the museum's exhibition for young visitors. And as part of that work, I was asked to go to the museum's library and have a look at diaries that had been kept by teenagers during the Holocaust, so that we could work on understanding the interior lives of young people as we were constructing this exhibition. At the time, there were about 7 or 8 diaries that were written by teenagers that had been published and that were still in print. So one of them, of course, remains the famous Diary of Anne Frank. And then there were quite a number of others that had been translated into English and published, but had gone out of print. So they were really only available in the museum's library or in a used bookstore. They weren't the kind of thing that you could easily find. And I often, when I'm invited to speak and I have an occasion to do so, I go back in my mind to the experience of reading these diaries. They were written by young people in Poland or in Lithuania, places that were very far away from me and from the life that I knew. But when I read them, I had this enormously visceral experience. And by that, I mean an experience that made me feel like I was transported to the places where these young people lived, and that I was watching events unfold as they had happened to them. And part of this is the great power of a diary, because diaries are kept in real time without a knowledge of the outcome, unlike a memoir that's written maybe dozens of years later, and the arc of the story is established. The writer knows what happened in the end. And so the story is constructed in that way. But in a diary, the writing is from day to day to day, and you don't know what's going to happen. And there tends to be this great detail and this sort of almost sometimes like a breathless quality, like you just wonder what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen tomorrow, just as the writer wondered what is going to happen tomorrow. And so I felt that I was transported to these places, and it made the experience of learning about the Holocaust very real to me and very powerful, and it made it matter in a way that it had not before. For any of you who've ever become obsessed with something, you know what happens, right? Whether it's anime or, something on YouTube, or you follow somebody who you really love, or you become very interested in, you know, a sport or an activity or a hobby, you know what it feels like to be obsessed, that it's all you can think about. And you want to learn every single thing that you possibly can about this subject. That's what happened to me. I was in my early 20s. I was working at the Holocaust Museum, but sort of as a side project, I started researching, trying to figure out everything I could about young people who had written diaries and journals during the Holocaust. It's important to remind everyone that this was in the early 1990s, as I said. So this was before the internet age, which means that there was no Google, which I know is a very difficult thing for many of us, even for me now, to imagine, to remember what it was like to do research at that time, when you couldn't simply go online and type in a search term and have thousands, hundreds of thousands of items come up. Instead, I was doing research really the way that it had been done for centuries before, which was that I started reading everything that I could about the Holocaust and everything that I could about young people. And very often the way that I found out about new diaries was that it would be mentioned, there would be a mention or a quote of a diary in a book about something else, a French history of the Holocaust or Dutch history of the Holocaust, not even necessarily about young people. And then I would go to the endnotes and try to find out, where is that diary located? And then there's this wonderful kind of, if you're me anyway, exciting kind of detective work, writing to the publisher or writing to the author, trying to track down where this diary might be located and then obtain a copy of it. And so this work was repeated over and over and over again. But at the same time, I was at the Holocaust Museum at a very pivotal moment when people were donating their diaries to the museum and people were doing enormous new research on the Holocaust, which was not something that existed in a centralized way before the Holocaust Museum existed. And so it happened then that as people started donating their diaries to the museum, the people in the collections or in the archives would notify me. People heard that I was interested in this subject, and they would say, we've just gotten something's been donated to the museum. Would you like to come and have a look? Or, hey, I just did an oral history with somebody and she mentioned that her sister kept a diary. Are you interested in learning more? And then I started reaching out to historians and archivists and really trying to comb through from a distance, from my office in Washington, D.C., the archives all across Europe and in Israel that held material having to do with the Holocaust, asking everyone that I could if they knew anything about any diaries written by young people, and if they did, would they send them to me? And so this work grew and grew and grew, and it became quite quickly something much bigger and much more overwhelming than I thought it was going to when I began. I'm going to jump ahead and say that it took me 10 years to assemble the research and compile the book that eventually became Salvaged Pages. And part of the reason for that was because the research grew and grew and grew, as I said. And part of it was because there was a lot of difficult work to do in understanding what these diaries meant and why they were important. In the end, at the time that Salvaged Pages came out, I had found nearly 60 diaries written by teenagers, and they represented a huge range of different countries all across Europe, written in different languages, different backgrounds, range of ages. The youngest was 12, the oldest was 21. Different ways of practicing Judaism. Some were very, very religious Orthodox Jews who really very strictly adhered to Jewish tradition and law. Others were very culturally identified with Jewishness. They felt themselves to be Jewish, but they weren't very practicing. They didn't go to synagogue, for example, or keep the Sabbath. And then there were some who were children of mixed marriages, whose one parent was Jewish and the other wasn't. And there was one young writer who had been converted to Catholicism when he was 7 or 8 years old as an attempt to save him. And he grew up Catholic. So there's this great range of languages, as I said, but most of all, different sized families, some from huge families, some from little families, some from rural areas, some from big cities, some were very sophisticated, came from wealthy families, some came from poor families, some barely had an education. So it was this incredible range, which made it immensely interesting because it wasn't just one voice. It was every time I turned around, there was a new perspective that was being added to this puzzle. But most of all, and this is such an important thing, I think, to say, most of all, the thing that made it so unique and so interesting is that every single voice is different. And that's true of the thousands of you who are listening to this today. There is no replicating anyone else's voice. Regardless of what your background is or your experience, your voice is your voice. And each writer was different. They had a different tone, a different way of talking about their lives or writing about their lives, a different way of thinking and processing their experiences. And I loved that about these diaries. So the really important framing that I want to say for this, there's sort of three important things to say about this body of material that I came to realize by the time that I published Salvaged Pages. First, these diaries are primary sources. They're historical sources, and I mentioned that earlier. The thing about a diary is that they have these, because they're written as events occur and because they're written in a certain place and time, they tend to capture enormous details, insight, the texture of daily life, exactly the kind of thing that gets lost from the perspective of even 1 year, let alone 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So it's like going back in time and seeing events through the eyes of the person who lived it. And this texture, this detail is just so quickly lost. And so writing it down helps to capture that. And I felt that in so many instances, I was able to understand the complexity of the moment, the moral dilemmas that people faced, the sadness, the pathos, the great complexity of daily life because of these diaries. The other way to think about them is as literary sources. So they're not art, they're not music, they're not photography. These are young people who are using the written word to capture something about the moment. But I think it's really important to say that not every writer is a great writer. You know, we have a little bit of a distorted sense of things because of the fame of Anne Frank's diaries. She was a wonderful writer. And people think that, you know, the only diaries that are valuable are diaries that are literary masterpieces. And some of them are, just like among those of you who are listening to this, some of you are writers, just like I'm a writer. Some of you want to use language in a creative way to express something, but other writers simply put down the details of their daily lives without a lot of literary flourish, without a lot of fancy language. And those diaries are every bit as meaningful and valuable as any others. So the idea is that language is the tool to try to preserve the experience and communicate it, not that it has to be a literary work of art in order to be valuable. And then the third thing that I think is just absolutely essential to say, and that I think about all the time, is that these are writings by young people, by adolescents. You know, adults, basically, by the time you're 30 or 40, you know, your identity is pretty fixed. You know, we change, we try, we grow, but adolescence is a time of, as you all know, enormous transition. The project of adolescence is to grapple with the question of who you are. What are you accepting and rejecting of everything that has been given to you at birth? Your family structure, your nationality, how do you feel about how you were raised? You know, your religion, your nationality, your culture, all the things that we're sort of born with. In adolescence, you're going through a process of filtering that and deciding, what do I accept and what do I reject? Now, of course, at the time, in the 1930s and 40s, what was not on the table is what is so much on the table now, which is gender identity and sexuality and other aspects of identity formation. When I talk about our identity in these diaries, I'm talking about a much narrower sort of perspective than what we have today. But nevertheless, that work of constructing the self is the same. And one of the things that is so powerful about teenagers' writings and diaries is that they capture this temporary moment. You know, you're passing through in your teens and your early 20s, and eventually we all forget what it was like. We all forget things that, you know, we might remember some things, but we forget the texture of that life. And so it's incredibly valuable to have people preserve those identity struggles and to that particular point of view on events that are happening. So the book came out, Salvaged Pages came out in 2002. And I went on to do some other things. And then in 2005, or leading up to 2005, we created a documentary film based on Salvaged Pages in partnership with MTV called I'm Still Here. And I wanted to play, for a moment, I wanted to play the very short trailer for this documentary because it gives you a good overview, I think, of what this whole topic is about. And also you'll get to see some images of the writers who kept diaries and just get a little bit of a sketch of the whole thing. So I'm going to share my screen, bear with me, because sometimes I'm a little clumsy with these things. Okay, so Sarah, I'm going to ask you to just give me a thumbs up to make sure the sound goes. Let's go back to the beginning.
April 20th. Today's that asshole Hitler's birthday.
Saturday, March 7th. When I look at the barbed wire that separates us from the rest of the world, my soul longs for freedom.
June 11th. I go on dreaming about survival and about getting fame in order to tell the world.
During the Holocaust, teenagers all over Europe recorded their experiences in diaries and journals. The most well-known was Anne Frank, who wrote her diary while hiding from the Nazis. But she wasn't the only one. After the war, other diaries written by young people were found in abandoned hiding places, in the rubble of the concentration camps, and in the safekeeping of trusted friends. The diaries bear witness to an uncommon courage and determination. These young writers refused to quietly disappear. Despite overwhelming obstacles, they made a mark on the world and left a record of their lives during the darkest of times.
So perhaps small apologies are needed. Oops, oh dear. Hold on one second. Sorry, this is not supposed to be doing that. Okay, sorry everyone. So small apologies for the bad word there, which I forgot was there. Hope it didn't offend anyone. So that gives you a little bit of an overview of what Salvaged Pages is about and then what the documentary is about. And I hope you were able to appreciate seeing some of the images of the young writers who wrote diaries at this time. So I want to jump ahead now to 2019. So in the years between 2005 and 2019, I continued to speak and teach about diaries of teenagers. We created educational materials for Salvaged Pages. We did all kinds of, there was a new paperback edition, there were all kinds of things. And at the same time, I got married, I had 2 children, I wrote another book, and I did other projects. But I always came back to this subject. it never left me, this idea of young people keeping diaries, particularly during the Holocaust, remained deeply, deeply important to me. And then in 17 or 18, I was invited to curate an exhibition for Holocaust Museum Houston on the subject of young writers' diaries. And initially we thought that the exhibition would be about the diaries that were in salvaged pages. But it seemed at that moment that it would be really important and appropriate to expand the scope of this work a little bit and to look at diaries kept by other kids who wrote during other times of war and genocide. And this experience of putting these Holocaust era diaries together with other teens writing in other conflicts, especially ones that were closer to our time, was enormously powerful. That exhibition is called And Still I Write, Young Diarists on War and Genocide. And in that exhibition, in addition to several diaries from salvaged pages, we also included non-Jewish victims of World War II, including a boy called Stanley Hayami, who wrote an amazing diary in a Japanese American internment camp. We also included young writers who wrote during the war in Bosnia, Herzegovina. We included a diary kept by a girl who wrote in Iraq during the war there, and a boy writing in Syria under ISIS. And it felt appropriate to the time and important to expand this sense of this group of young people to include different religions, different ethnicities, and different kinds of conflicts, and to think about the themes that ran all the way across the body of material. Meanwhile, what happened was that in the summer of 2019, as we were finishing this exhibition and getting ready to open it, and there was an enormous amount of work to do to prepare, I was in Houston, and it was right at the time that the Trump administration's family separation policy was being carried out at the US border. So the news was dominated by information about young people who were being separated from their parents and being held in detention centers on the US border. And here I was reading and studying the writings of teens in crisis, kids who were separated from their parents, kids who were lonely, who were afraid, who were uncertain about the future. And this crisis was taking place not far away, not in some other distant corner of the world, and not in some time that had happened dozens of years ago, but right now. And I think it's important to say that I'm not suggesting that what happened on the US border is the same at all. But I am saying that I started to think to myself, who are the kids in these circumstances today? And what are they thinking and feeling? And are any of them writing diaries? What might we learn if we were able to understand their interior lives as they're going through this personal and national crisis? There wasn't really very much that I could do about that at the moment, but those questions stayed with me. And I started to think about, across this country, who are the salvaged pages writers of today? Who are kids living, not necessarily in war and genocide, but just daily life, kids dealing with all different kinds of challenges and problems in all different parts of America, including some pockets and corners of this country where kids are in crisis. What about, for example, the opioid epidemic? What about kids who are in juvenile detention, or kids who are on the border, who are recent immigrants to this country, who are struggling to seek asylum or find their home here? What about young people living in Native American reservations, for example, or in American cities, on farms? What does it mean to be a young person living day-to-day life in America today? Whose young voices are we not hearing? That was the question that just kept going around and around in my mind. And then the pandemic happened. And suddenly we were all in crisis. Suddenly we were all living through a collective moment that was unlike anything that we had ever experienced before. And I started thinking, what would happen if right now I launched a project to try to capture some of these records of young people, to try to understand what young people are experiencing in their own words in real time today. And that is how Dispatches from Quarantine came about. I was able to partner with a great organization called the Educators Institute for Human Rights. And a group of us got together and we decided that for 6 weeks, we were going to each week launch a prompt. We were going to pull a diary entry or something that had been kept historically by a teenager in a war or conflict or genocide, share that quote, share some thoughts about it, and ask young people to think about themselves on a continuum. What did it mean to participate in the history of young people who have picked up a pen, or in our case, written on a cell phone or a computer, looked around at what was happening in the world around them and documented their experiences. And we ended up launching Dispatches from Quarantine pretty soon after the lockdown started. It ran in April and May of 2020. And then we spent about a year culling through the hundreds and hundreds of entries that we received and creating a gallery of materials that we could share with the public. And so now, again, I'm going to share with you there's a short piece, a 6-minute piece that was done by NPR that includes readings of young people writing from their own contributions to Dispatches from Quarantine with me talking in between. It's 6 minutes long, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and play it. It's just audio because it's a radio program. And then I'll come back and I'll have a few concluding things to say, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I'm really tired of the world ending.
There we go.
It's the world ending.
I'm really sick of this.
If I go out on unnecessary trips, does that make me a bad person?
I lose myself in daydreams so as to not lose myself in panic.
I don't know what comes next.
Nobody seems to know what is going on.
The only human interaction I have is with my family.
Those are some of the students who took part in Alexandra Zapruder's project, Dispatches from Quarantine, Young People on COVID-19.
We began the project back in April of 2020, shortly after we all went into quarantine. With the proliferation of social media, I started to think about how diaries have basically been supplanted. And what's a little bit been lost is the kind of quiet reflection, the authentic preservation of experiences that are captured in diaries.
I go outside to forget about what's going on outside of my clean, white fence.
Now, though, to go out is largely viewed as a selfish act, one which puts our own desire for a little happiness over the safety of all.
It's really sad that people can't celebrate their birthdays with their friends. My birthday is coming up relatively soon, and I'm a bit worried.
You know, of course, young people write about what you expect that they would write about. Some of them wrote about missing school or about missing out on prom or the regular kinds of things that one would expect.
I know it's dumb to be focused on hoping we get to be back in school in the fall and have a cross-country season when thousands of people are dying.
But there's so much that is unexpected. And one of the things that came up again and again and again was the way that young people experienced the quarantine as a kind of reprieve from their daily life.
I can hear the birds chirping all the time now. I never used to listen to the birds before, too busy running around from activity to activity.
Which has this effect of reminding us how much pressure teens are under. And it's not because they said, I'm under pressure. It's because they said, for the first time I get to breathe. You know, there's this one beautiful entry with a young writer saying,
for the first time in such a long while, I've been able to just stop and sit. I've been able to focus on myself and heal a bit in a world that's so broken.
Certainly there is a lot of fear. These entries really capture the immediacy of that fear and the helplessness. You know, young people are at the mercy of their parents and the decisions that they're making. And so they're not always feeling safe because they're not making their own choices.
I was ill until proven healthy. My mother left me small foods laid on paper plates on the stairs, running away as I came out.
Maya Siegel's poem was one of the first that came in, and it knocked me out. she writes about the tension in her family because she's in quarantine and her mother is sort of freaking out about her own safety.
I despised her for being so scared of me, for crying to the doctor. If she comes down, I will feel panicked. I did not come down. I stayed still for 6 days, 4 of which I did not get out of bed.
Lots of kids wrote about how they were reconnecting with their families.
I've been playing board games like Monopoly with my family. My mom's been crushing us.
And how they were so happy to get to spend time with their parents or their siblings, which is not something that we would necessarily expect.
We video called with my Nana this weekend, something I would never have believed I'd do in my lifetime.
The other area that definitely comes up in a number of entries is about Asian American hate. This is true in the reflection of Iron Shim, who writes very, very powerfully about, a casual joke that was very hurtful to her.
My best friend asked if my mom is cooking a bat for dinner. Haha, didn't laugh. It's just a joke.
Young people, we forget just how astute they are and just how much they're seeing and taking in of the world around us.
Every day I am dismayed by what I find, disappointed in my country, and infuriated that such attacks are not reprimanded by the public.
We were so glad to have such a wide range of experiences. Someone like Fiona Dong, who was going to school in Massachusetts and was called to return home to China.
I still clearly remember when the corona outbreak happened in China. I checked the data on the number of cases every morning after I woke up.
And so wrote at length about her journey back home.
The airline stewardess gave us some food and drinks packed in a plastic bag. She told us not to eat at the same time as our neighbor and that it was the only meal that they would serve on this flight. Thinking of the risk that I needed to take for eating that food, I gave up.
Too scared to eat on the plane, and then 2 weeks by herself in a hotel room, and we want to and need to preserve those little details because that's the texture of daily life. That's the stuff we're going to forget 20 years from now. We were very conscious to say, if you want to write what is the equivalent of a diary entry, that's great. But we'll take anything. We'll take poetry. We'll take art, photography. So we got a lot of different things. And we got a wonderful song by a young girl named Niobe Benjamin, who wrote about all the things that she was missing while she was in quarantine.
Think of what we played, and now how everything has changed. And I guess I understand how it fell apart and you didn't try to fix it then.
I think that this project confirmed what I believe so deeply, which is that what young people have to say about their lives really matters. And that there are young people who want to observe, describe, and reflect upon their experiences. They want to contribute to the historical and literary record. I'm a big believer in the need for an archive that really preserves those kinds of records for the benefit of all of us.
I'm scared to start over, need a four-leaf clover to wish a happy ending, 'cause why are we pretending that everything will be alright?
Alexandra Zapruder is the curator of an online gallery called Dispatches from Quarantine. And the students you just heard are
Maya Siegel,
Claire Hammond,
Sam Kaufman,
Jack Trapanick,
Fiona Dong,
Kylie Mosser, Katrina Hook, Iron Shim,
Niobe Benjamin.
So before I close, I just I want to briefly show you the gallery. Can you see this, Sarah? When I've changed the screen. Okay, good. So this is my website, alexandrazapruder.com, and on the website there's all kinds of stuff you can see, but Dispatches from Quarantine is a separate little tab. And if you go to the gallery, you will find a 36, I think it is, entries, writings, artwork that young people kept, Niobe's song, and other contributions. And the one thing that I do want to say is that we are still taking contributions for Dispatches from Quarantine. So there's a page here with all of the prompts, the directions, and all of the prompts, the 6 prompts that we posted. And then there's a submit page, and you can choose a prompt if you want, or choose all the prompts, or you can simply submit something that you've written or something you've made, a photograph, a work of art, anything that you might want. Does not have to be tied to the prompts. And I certainly would encourage anyone who's interested to share and to contribute, because we do so much want to hear from you. So the last thing that I want to say is that about this topic, and then I think we'll take questions, is that diaries for young people, for you who are listening to this, you have sort of a double opportunity here. Diaries themselves, regardless of who writes them, as I've said before, capture a moment in time that can never be captured again. Every single moment we live, everything that is happening around us and inside us is potentially interesting and valuable to future us, to ourselves in the future, and to other people. And attending to those details, looking around, paying attention to what's happening inside, and capturing that is an intrinsically valuable and meaningful thing to do. But teens in particular have another layer, and that is that when you write as a young people, you're capturing a moment in life that is not capturable again. It's a perspective, a view, a meaningful moment that we as adults cannot recover. And that too is potentially interesting and valuable to future you and to other people. So there's sort of two layers. There's the layer of a diary and the passage of time, and there's the layer of adolescence and the moment in a person's life. And so I just encourage you so much to think about what you might gain by this endeavor. It's very simple. Observe the world around you and the world inside you. Describe what you see, what you hear, what you feel, and reflect upon it. Observe, describe, and reflect. That's all there is to it. And you never know what value it might hold for yourself and for others in the future. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And I think at this point, it would be a good moment to take a break and take questions. Is that good, Sarah?
That sounds great. Thank
Good.
you, Alexandra. That was so interesting and fascinating. And I already have a really a broad array of questions here. And
Great.
so I'm just going to jump right in, and we'll jump around with the questions.
Sure.
So there was a question about in the 30s, you were talking about diaries of young people from the 30s during the Holocaust. And you talked about how there was kind of a narrow range of what they were grappling with in terms of identity and what was allowed and mainstream at the time.
Yep.
But did you encounter any young people who were grappling with gender or sexual identity?
I did not. And it's so interesting because even I think about this all the time, because even when I'm 51 years old. So even when I was in high school, which was 30 years ago or 35 years ago, there was almost no discussion. There was no discussion of gender identity. A couple of kids in my very, very, very large public school came out, but almost none. Most of the men and women that I know from my high school days who came out did so in adulthood. So you can imagine if you then scroll back in time in the 1930s and 40s, how very, very, very rare it would have been. Most of what we see in terms of that sort of area are people grappling with relationships. There's a lot of relationship questions, but they are always girls and boys and boys and girls, which doesn't mean that there are not stories of, for example, of course, homosexuals who, gay men or women who lived through the Holocaust and were persecuted, but it's not reflected in any of the diaries that I have found.
Did you find that a number of the diaries were written for an audience? Kind of like a la Anne Frank was the example that was provided. And did you find that varied at all based on the time period or the conflict or crisis, geography? Was there any
Okay, so this is
pattern?
a great question because there's so many things that I didn't get to. And so I'm so glad that you asked this. This whole question of privacy and who is a diary for, is the diary for the self or is the diary for others, is something that changes over time. So historically, we think of diaries as being private records, right? That's kind of how we imagine them, is that they're written for the self. But it is true that in times of crisis, when there is no other avenue, people are not publishing, there is by definition a kind of silence imposed on people, the purpose of a diary can change. So among the young writers whose diaries are included in salvaged pages and that I found in other places, the diaries really range. There's some writers who said very explicitly in their diaries that they meant them to be just for themselves, or they intended them to be a place to, one writer, Moshe Flinker, said, I don't want to be idle or lazy, so I'm using my diary as a place to keep track of what I'm doing every day. Another writer, Eva Ginzova, writing in Theresienstadt, wrote in her diary, I'm writing this to feel closer to my parents who I've been separated from. But then there are writers like a young boy called Yitzhak Rudashevsky who wrote in Vilna, and another boy who wrote in Lodz Ghetto, and a girl who wrote in Terezin called Alice Ehrman, who wrote very clearly that their diaries were intended as a public record. And this is a direct response, I think, to the persecution that they were feeling. It was because they were being silenced, because they were being discriminated, because the world didn't know what was happening to them. Their diaries were their only means to leave a public record of what happened to them. And they didn't know if they were going to survive. So they knew that these diaries might be, as was the case for some of them, the only record left of their lives, let alone their experiences. Now, one thing that's so fascinating in the exhibition that I curated in Houston is that as technology changes, we get into the late 1990s and the 2000s, the whole idea of what a diary is changes. So for example, the diaries that were kept in Bosnia were like proper diaries, like what you think of, a notebook, pen and paper. But by the time you get to the Iraqi diary, the girl who wrote during the Iraq War, she's writing it as a blog. She's writing it online and she's posting it every day. And there's an interactive element because people are reading it and commenting. So the diary form changes. And then the young boy Samer, whose identity is not known because for his safety, who wrote in the war when ISIS took over Syria, he was writing on his cell phone, encrypting the messages and secretly sending them via a third party to a journalist who was outside of the country, a BBC journalist. So the diary is still engaged in that same process to observe, describe, reflect, but clearly with an eye towards a need to let people know what's going on inside this closed society. So technology changes, the way that people think about their diaries change, circumstances change. Some people still view their diaries as deeply private internal documents, and other people view them as a way to let the world know what's happening to them. So it's a fascinating question. I'm so glad that you asked that.
I get no credit for that one, but I have another great one here.
Okay, good.
Is there a specific story or diary that gave you the chills that I guess stood out for you?
I mean, I always think it's like your children, it's like you love them all. You can't have you can't have a favorite. But I will say that the very first diary that I read way back in the early 1990s was after I read the Diary of Anne Frank. The next one that I read, the first one that I read that I wasn't one that I had ever heard of before, was by a boy called Yitzhak Rudashevsky, whose name I mentioned just a minute ago. And he is and remains for me sort of the North Star of this project. First among equals, you could say. Because his diary really transformed my idea of what a diary could be and why records like this matter so much. And I believe now, looking back on this from this vantage point, that it was Rudashevsky's diary that sparked everything that followed and that holds my interest. His diary is so dear to me, and it's so because he was a beautiful writer and I identify with him as someone who loved language, but also because he was a visionary. He had an idea about what young people in the ghetto needed to do to sustain themselves and to keep their intellectual and creative and cultural lives going in this time of stagnation, a resistance and a defiance of persecution. And I think that's very much at the core of all of the diaries that exist, even if it's not said explicitly.
Do you think that journaling is good for mental health?
I do. I do think journaling is good for mental health. I mean, I think that it's, any time that you can put things down. Look, let me say it a different way. Journaling can be good for mental health, and it can be hard. It can be hard to confront the reality of your life. I think it takes a lot of courage, especially when you're in a time of crisis, to put words down in black and white and to see them in front of you. I have always found it a very good way to sort out my thoughts, to untangle things in my mind. And so I rely on that form. For some people, there might be other outlets, but I do believe that it has a profound value. It can have a profound value because it takes the sort of abstract messiness of our brain and makes it concrete. And that can sometimes help us find ways to tackle our problems.
I have an educator question here,
Okay.
which is, do you have certain diaries or parts of salvage pages that you recommend for a middle school audience versus a high school audience?
So I do want to say that we created educational materials for salvaged pages, and they exist. You can find them on my website. They exist through Facing History and Ourselves. I would say that resource is designed primarily for high schools. I think some of the issue with the diaries and salvaged pages for middle school is not so much that the content is so heavy, although there are parts that are heavy. It's more that in some cases, it's just sort of developmentally a little too advanced. So I would say the Diary of the Anonymous Girl Writing in Lodge Ghetto is a great one for middle schoolers, even though it's difficult. She is has a very approachable voice. Rudashevsky, whose diary I love, is very lofty and very literary. So if you have an English language arts class, of middle schoolers who are sophisticated readers, I think you could use it. The Diary of David Rubinowitz is great because he was younger. He was 12 when he started writing. And so his diary really is at the level of middle school. I would say the first 3 diaries in the book, Klaus Langer, Elizabeth Kaufman, and Peter Feigl, are also all good for middle schoolers because they're written in the late 1930s. They're not quite as heavy as some of the later diaries when you're really in the ghetto and there's so much that is violent that is happening around. So those are some recommendations I think that I could make.
No, that's great.
I'll probably think of others, but those I think are the ones that come to mind.
So then there's another question here about how now we're all in crisis, and you mentioned that we've all been in crisis. Did that shape or change the way you approach these diaries and material?
Yes and no. I mean, I think in some ways for me, it was a little, as I probably for all of us, it was a little surprising, after years and years and years of studying other people's crises to then be in a crisis. And the crisis for me, I will just say, is not so much for my own self, but I have 2 children. I have a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. And they had a very, 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 very hard year. Even though we have all kinds of privilege and, we're very fortunate, I really saw how the pandemic came down on 2 teens. And so I think that always deepens one's own experience and your capacity for empathy when you see your own life upended. And I always want to hold that tension between how much can I relate And also, how much is this not my story? You know, how protected I feel from the worst effects of this pandemic, although I had my share of losses, as we all did. The thing that was most interesting to me was to do dispatches from quarantine and to think about a contemporary form of this writing. It's so interesting to me that, like, I started with the 40s and the 30s, started with the Holocaust, and then gradually got like closer and closer to the present day. And then the pandemic happened, and it was like, oh, this is happening. Like, let's do this and see. And what we got was so insightful. It completely confirmed everything that I believe about why it's important for young people to keep these kinds of records and why it's important for us to preserve them.
I think I'll ask a kind of a wrap it up question.
Okay.
Which is, what's next for Dispatches from Quarantine, and how can our young people get involved or contribute?
Yay! Thank you for answering and for asking that question. So as I said, the best way to get involved and contribute is to go to my website, which is just my name, www.alexandrazapruder.com. Go to Dispatches, have a look at the prompts, see if something speaks to you, or go straight to the submit button. If you've already written something, if you wrote something a year ago and you want to share it, if you made a picture, if you took a photograph, if you've got an audio diary, if you've got a video that you did, anything you want, upload it, and we'll be very glad to preserve it. In terms of what's next for Dispatches from Quarantine, there is an immediate phase and a longer term phase. The immediate next step is that we are convening a very small group of young people to do a sort of 12-week intensive diary writing program. We're trying to sort of create a program and see what happens, because we did learn things from the way that we ran dispatches. One of the things that we learned is that it might be better to, in some ways, to help people understand the historical connection between the diaries from the past and the present, or to be able to talk about issues of privacy and authenticity, or to talk about things like social media. What's the relationship between social media and diary writing? All these kinds of questions. So we're going to run this very little pilot program to kind of test doing it a different way. But my vision, my longer term vision for Dispatches, which is just fairly far away from actually happening, but I hope will happen, is to really create eventually a platform, a journal writing platform for teens that is structured, that provides all kinds of necessary safeguards, but also allows young people to understand themselves on the continuum of writers throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, and to create a way to archive and preserve and hold those records for not only for posterity, but also for the use in the future of historians, writers, anthropologists, therapists, doctors. So we're thinking about that. We're thinking about what form that might take. But I really believe that we need to elevate the idea of young people as meaningful documentarians of their time, that this is something that matters, that we don't have anything like a youth archive in America or anywhere. And what might we understand about the world if we collected those kinds of writings, and if we honored them and listened to them? Who knows what it would change? It might change policy. It might change the way that we talk to teens. It might change the way that we teach. It might change the way that we parent. We grow up and we lose access to an understanding of we forget what it was like. And I want to preserve that for the historical record and for all the other reasons that I mentioned.
I think that's a wonderful and an incredible goal, and I'm so glad that you're working your way towards it and that we can possibly play a role. Thank you, Alexandra, for such a wonderful presentation. Thank you for continuing to partner with us. Something I want to flag for all of our educators who are listening. We are going to be doing a professional development workshop with Alexandra in the fall, so stay tuned, because we do want to continue to pursue this idea of processing and contributing to the historical record, but also to the wellness and well-being of our youth. And I think the youth are just already doing so much incredible work. And so if we can further provide you a platform, we're here. Thank you, everyone, just for joining us for our 39th colloquium. We will be heard. Thank you to our staff and our volunteers for making today a success. Thank you to our Chhange members, our friends, our schools, our educators, our students, and the various organizations who help to lift us up during these difficult times and give us a day like today where we can deliver this kind of program and celebrate all that is wonderful and tremendous about our youth. I want to just say thank you. Thank you for being here. Stay tuned. You'll be receiving some resources from us, including access to over 20 workshops on our YouTube channel. And until then, take care, be well, and see you soon.